By 0147 local time on the 15th of July 2026, the duty operator at Russia's Southern Energy Dispatch Center in Krasnodar had been staring at the same stable grid readouts for 6 hours. Routine night, the kind of shift you stop really seeing. Then, in the span of 4 seconds, 3 separate monitoring nodes dropped offline. Not a cascade failure. Not a blown transformer. 3 nodes, simultaneously, in 3 different directions. He reached for the intercom. He never finished the sentence. 400 kilometers to the northwest, over the Black Sea coast, something that looked like a slow-moving flock of birds on radar had already cleared the last early warning perimeter. It was not birds, it was the leading edge of what Ukrainian long-range drone units had spent weeks planning, a synchronized multi-node strike across 9 Russian regions, timed to land within a single 90-minute window. 3 oil refineries, 1 major power distribution hub, all at once. Russia's damage control apparatus, the teams, the responders, the regional emergency coordinators, can handle 1 major strike. They have the protocols. They have the redundancy. They practiced it. What they have no protocol for is 3 refineries and a grid node going down before the first report from the first site has even been filed. That is the architecture of what happened on the night of July 14th into 15th. But before we walk through how the strike unfolded, system by system, layer by layer, there is one detail that most coverage missed entirely. The Kerch blackout that hit Crimea the same night was not a coincidence. It was not a separate operation, and by the time we get to why those 2 things were coordinated, you will understand why this was not a raid. This was a stress test, a deliberate attempt to find the ceiling of what Russian emergency response can absorb simultaneously. Stay with it, because the answer changes what the next 6 months of this war look like. Start with the targets themselves. 3 refineries. The Ilsky refinery northeast of Krasnodar. The Slavyansk on Kuban facility roughly 60 kilometers southeast of it. And a 3rd installation east of the Urals, near Orsk in the Orenburg region. That 3rd target is the one that matters most strategically, and we will get there. But first, understand what these facilities actually do. Not the abstraction of oil infrastructure, but the specific, unglamorous, load-bearing function they serve inside Russia's war economy right now. The Ilsky refinery processes roughly 4 million tons of crude annually. Its primary output is diesel and aviation kerosene. Diesel moves supplies to the front. Aviation kerosene fuels the Su-34 strike sorties over Zaporizhia and Kherson. When analysts talk about Russia's fuel supply chain, Ilsky is one of the facilities they mean. The Slavyansk on Kuban plant is smaller, closer to 2 million tons capacity, but it sits at a junction in the regional pipeline network that makes it disproportionately difficult to bypass. Lose Slavyansk on Kuban, and you cannot simply reroute. You wait, or you truck it. Both options are slow. Both options are expensive. At the current tempo of Russian ground operations, slow and expensive has operational consequences. And then there is Orsk. The Orsk refinery in Orenburg Oblast sits approximately 1,800 kilometers from the nearest active front line. That is not a typo. 1,800 kilometers. The people who work there, who live in the city around it, who send their children to school in the morning, they have spent 2.5 years of full-scale war assuming they were simply too far away. That assumption held until approximately 02:15 local time on the 15th of July. What makes Orsk strategically significant is not just the distance, it is what the facility refines. Orsk handles a significant portion of the heavy fuel oil that feeds industrial heating plants across the southern Urals region. Disrupt Orsk's output, and you are not just squeezing military logistics, you are touching the civilian heating and power infrastructure of a geographic zone Russia has treated as the rear, as the untouchable interior. Ukrainian planners chose it for exactly that reason. Now, how do you get a drone to Orsk? How does anything Ukraine currently operates, the FP2 fixed-wing strike drone, the slower but longer-legged variants built for deep interdiction, how does any of that cover 1,800 kilometers of Russian airspace, cross the Volga, cross the southern Urals, and arrive on target at a coordinated time? That is the question this strike forces you to answer. And the answer reveals something important about how Ukraine has rebuilt its long-range strike doctrine since the beginning of 2026. The FP2, the designation most commonly used in Western open-source analysis for the class of Ukrainian fixed-wing strike drones operating at this range, is not a fast weapon. It cruises at speeds in the range of 120 to 180 kilometers per hour, depending on payload and flight profile. At that speed, a route to Orsk requires something between 10 and 14 hours of flight time, accounting for the routing necessary to avoid the denser radar and air defense corridors closer to the Ukrainian border. That means some of the drones that struck Orsk lifted off the night before, on the evening of the 14th, before most of Russia's emergency management staff had even finished their day shift. This is the layered timing architecture that Russian air defense has to defeat, not a wave, not a clear moment of launch that triggers a clear defensive response. A slow, staggered infiltration that looks like noise for hours, and only resolves into a recognizable attack package when it is already too late to scramble an adequate intercept. Let us go inside the first defensive layer. Russia's radar coverage across the interior is not uniform. It was never designed to be. The Integrated Air Defense Network, the system of S-400 batteries, the Nebo-M VHF radar stations, the Podlet K-1 low-altitude detection radars, was built primarily to protect key nodes: Moscow, St. Petersburg, major military installations, the border regions closest to NATO. The southern Urals, historically, received a lighter layer. The strategic logic was reasonable in a pre-2022 world. The threat was assumed to come from the west or northwest, from standoff missiles, from high-altitude platforms, not from cheap propeller-driven drones flying low over the steppe for 12 hours. The Nebo VHF radar that covers the Orenburg sector has a detection range against conventional aircraft out to approximately 600 kilometers. Against a small fixed-wing drone at low altitude, radar cross-section in the range of 0.01 square meters or less, the effective detection range collapses dramatically. Some Ukrainian drone types have been reported operating below 50 meters above ground level through certain corridor segments, using terrain masking, following river valleys and low-lying ground contours. The Nebo-M does not see what it cannot see above the radar horizon, and at low altitude, the radar horizon is close. The duty officer at the Orsk Regional Air Defense Coordination Post, whatever the specific designation of that posting, would have been working with degraded picture for a significant portion of the drone's approach. What returns appeared on the tracking system would have been intermittent, inconsistent, the kind of fragmented contact that looks like sensor noise, looks like a flock of migrating birds, looks like a weather artifact, until it does not. The FP2 class drone carries a warhead estimated at between 40 and 60 kilograms of high explosive, depending on the specific variant and payload configuration. That is not a weapon that announces itself on approach. It announces itself on impact. At the Ilsky and Slavyansk on Kuban facilities in the Krasnodar region, the threat geometry was different, closer to the front, closer to the Ukrainian border. The air defense layer there is heavier. Pantsir S-1 self-propelled air defense systems have been deployed to protect southern Russian infrastructure since 2023, following repeated strikes on Krasnodar region fuel and logistics targets. The Pantsir S-1 is a capable short-range system. Its 57 E-6 missiles engage targets out to roughly 20 kilometers, at altitudes from ground level to 15 kilometers. Its 30mm guns handle the close-in threats the missiles cannot engage. On paper, it is exactly what you want guarding a refinery against a slow drone. The issue is saturation. The Pantsir S-1 engages one track at a time. A single battery can handle a limited number of simultaneous engagements. When the drone count crossing into its engagement zone exceeds that number, when there are more inbound tracks than available fire channels, the battery commander has to make choices. Which one is the decoy? Which one is the actual warhead carrier? Which track do you take first? In the seconds available, with degraded electronic warfare picture, those choices are made under conditions that favor the attacker. Ukrainian drone doctrine since early 2026 has leaned heavily into this mathematics. You do not need to defeat the Pantsir, you need to feed it more decisions than it can process cleanly. Open-source imagery and Russian telegram channels tracking the strike's reported secondary explosions at the Ilsky facility, consistent with fuel storage tank ignition, the characteristic progression where an initial warhead impact on a processing unit triggers a larger fuel fire that then propagates to adjacent storage. Secondary detonations of that type are operationally significant. They mean the fire cannot be simply suppressed. It has to burn, and while it burns, the facility is not refining. Now, the power grid node. The target Ukrainian strike drones hit on the same night, described by Ukrainian energy sector analysts and confirmed in part by regional blackout reports, was a high-voltage distribution substation serving the southern Russian grid interconnect. The specific facility has not been officially identified, but the reported pattern of the blackouts that followed, affecting portions of 9 regions including Krasnodar, Rostov, Stavropol, and others, is consistent with a strike on a 500 kilovolt switching substation at a grid junction. These facilities are the load distribution backbone of the regional power network. They are not power generation. They are the switching points that route electricity between generators and consumers. When one fails catastrophically, the grid does not simply lose what that substation was carrying. The automatic protective relays on adjacent lines trip to prevent cascade overload. Sections go dark in sequence, faster than any human operator can intervene. Russia's unified power grid has redundancy built in from the Soviet era. It is not fragile in the sense of having single points of catastrophic failure, but it is fragile in the sense that major junction substations take a long time to repair when physically destroyed. Spare 500 kilovolt transformers are not items you keep in a warehouse. Lead times for replacement, even under normal procurement conditions, run to months. Under current sanction conditions, the procurement picture is considerably more complicated. Ukrainian targeting of power grid infrastructure has followed a deliberate logic, not to cause permanent darkness, but to impose recurring repair burden, to drain the stockpile of spare components, to make the grid progressively more difficult to fully restore before the next strike. The Kerch situation, the blackout on Crimea's power infrastructure reported the same night, completes the picture of what analysts at the Institute for the Study of War described in their July 15th dispatch as a pattern shift in Ukrainian long-range strike doctrine. Kerch is where the fixed land connection to Crimea terminates. The power line infrastructure serving Crimea runs through that junction. A strike there, on the same night as strikes in Krasnodar and Orsk and the grid node, is not coincidental. It is the fifth element of a 5-node simultaneous pressure event. Russia's emergency repair teams cannot be in 5 places at once. They have to prioritize, and every hour spent prioritizing one site is an hour the others remain degraded. This is the doctrine shift. Ukraine spent the earlier phases of the deep strike campaign on high-value single targets: depots, airfields, command nodes, individual warships. High impact but manageable. Russia learned to absorb it. Built repair protocols, pre-positioned spare parts, dispersed high-value assets. The new doctrine does not aim at single high-value targets. It aims at the response capacity itself. It asks, how many simultaneous failures can the system manage before the triage process breaks down and some fraction of the damage simply stays? The answer, from the reporting on the July 14th night, appears to be fewer than 5. Now the fuel context. Because the Orsk and Krasnodar refinery strikes do not exist in isolation, they land on top of an already severely stressed Russian fuel supply situation. Open-source maritime analysts tracking the so-called shadow fleet, the network of aging flags of convenience tankers Russia has assembled to move sanctioned crude oil, reported in early July that roughly 135 million barrels of Russian oil were effectively frozen at sea. Sanction enforcement actions, port refusals, and insurance complications had created a situation where a significant fraction of Russia's export crude was sitting in tankers that could not discharge cargo at willing buyers. This was already squeezing Russia's foreign currency earnings. The domestic refinery damage now applies pressure from the other direction simultaneously. You cannot export the crude that is stuck at sea. You cannot process the crude that would have gone to the refineries that are now on fire. The supply is being squeezed from both ends of the chain at the same time. For Russian military logistics, the practical consequence plays out at the fuel depot level, at the forward distribution point level, at the level of the vehicle maintenance companies trying to keep armored vehicles and artillery prime movers operational. Fuel rationing at the operational level is not a theoretical concern. It has appeared in Russian military communications intercepted and published by Ukrainian military intelligence on multiple occasions in 2025 and 2026. What the July 15th strikes do is accelerate the timeline on which fuel availability becomes a hard operational constraint rather than a manageable inconvenience. So what does this mean for the weeks ahead? There are two things worth watching closely. The first is Russia's air defense redistribution response. After a strike of this geographic breadth, from the Krasnodar region to Orenburg, the pressure on Russian military planners to redistribute Pantsir S-1 batteries and S-350 Vityaz assets toward the interior is significant. Every battery moved to protect an Orsk equivalent target is a battery not defending the frontline logistics corridor. Ukrainian targeting planners will be watching that redistribution. Gaps created by redeployment are opportunities. The second thing to watch is the grid repair timeline. If the high-voltage substation struck on the 14th requires a major transformer replacement, and if Russia's sanctioned procurement pipeline cannot supply that transformer within a reasonable window, then the Krasnodar region enters the summer and autumn with reduced grid redundancy. That matters in the context of continued Ukrainian strike pressure. A grid with reduced redundancy tolerates subsequent strikes less well than a fully restored one. Ukraine has demonstrated it can find and hit these nodes. The question is whether Russia can repair faster than Ukraine can restrike. ISW's July 15th analysis noted that the geographic spread of this night's operation, from Crimea to the Urals, represents the widest single-night footprint of any Ukrainian deep strike operation on record. That record may not stand long. If you want to understand this war as it unfolds, not the noise, the strategy underneath the headlines, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you are there the moment the next chapter breaks. Hit the bell. And one final note for the record, this report is news analysis and reconstruction of ongoing fast-moving events built on reporting from major outlets and grounded in the facts as they are known at the time of writing. As the situation develops, details will change. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.